Libertarianism is all about individual liberty, and it should never be defined by the terms liberal or conservative.
And communism is no good.
That's right. Big swing and a miss.
Yeah.
All right, guys, welcome to episode 12 of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. We're doing something totally different today. This is going to be a completely off-the-cuff episode where I'm going to talk about the recent Mises Caucus takeover of the Libertarian Party. We're going to ask whether or not the Mises Caucus is full of racist, and if you don't know what the Mises Caucus is, we're going to define that for you today. But before we get into the episode, I want to talk a little bit about how this show works, because when you're hearing this, it's probably going to be sometime in mid to late July. So I've mentioned this on the show before, but just because of time constraints and everything, I want to make sure that I have an episode to deliver to you guys every single Tuesday. So I oftentimes record these episodes 3 or 4 weeks in advance. So I write an episode, I'll come up with a script for it. I'll record it, and then I'll put it out a couple of weeks in advance. And I want to be able to figure out a way in the future to do more current events type episodes like this. But it's going to require me to kind of figure out how to manage the time and everything like that a little more effectively. We're still on episode 12. I got a long time to take care of this. Again, this podcast is not going to become a current events or another, political commentary podcast. There are way too many of those out there, and there are people, several of whom I'm going to mention today, that do it way better than I could. I want to keep this podcast focused on philosophy and on books and on big ideas and things like that. But there are going to be times where we'll dive into current events. The other thing that I think is really funny here too is if you're listening to this show and you're a libertarian, you probably have heard Dave Smith's Part of the Problem podcast. Dave Smith is one of the biggest names in the libertarian movement right now, and his podcast is fantastic. Not a family-friendly podcast, so if you have children in the car or whatever, I wouldn't recommend downloading it and listening to it with your kids around, but it is great, and Dave Smith's take on libertarianism is fantastic. But I just to give you a little background into this episode, I was listening to a lot of podcasts about the Mises Caucus takeover of the Libertarian Party and just kind of thinking about what that meant. And then I met with the Libertarian Party of Northern Kentucky and just was kind of hearing several of the guys that are in that group that I go to once a month were delegates at the Libertarian Convention in Reno, Nevada at the end of May. And so they were talking about their experience, and I wanted to get an episode of the show where I just kind of talked about it because I saw that the Mises Caucus obviously dominated the Libertarian Party and was generating some news out there, and I just wanted a chance to discuss it. So June 15th, I sat down, read through a bunch of articles, and I came up with the script for this show. I'm recording it on June 16th, so again, it won't be released for about a month after this, so this all might be old news. So hopefully it'll be a good refresher for you, but the ironic thing is, I sat down in the afternoon on June 15th to write this episode, got it all written up, and then by the time I was done, Dave Smith had already released another episode of Part of the Problem where he criticizes the exact same articles that I'm going to be criticizing today. So if you listen to Part of the Problem, you've already heard a lot of this, and if you want to, you could probably skip over the episode until the very end where I kind of give my direct thoughts on how I think the Libertarian Party needs to proceed in the future from a Protestant point of view. But yeah, this is going to be covering the exact same thing that Dave Smith covered in his June 15th episode of Part of the Problem. I put a link to it down there at the bottom. He's going to go into a lot more depth, and since he obviously is very involved in the party, I'm not really a political guy. I'm more interested in the philosophical side of it, but his take is going to be a lot more accurate than mine is. But today, I do hope that even though this has been covered, and by the time you hear this, it might be old news, for those of you that are unfamiliar with the Libertarian Party, I am going to give you a little bit of background on that, and then also talk about the Mises Caucus, what that means for the LP, why people are criticizing it, and what I think they should do in the future. So I'm just excited to be able to share my thoughts with you guys today. A lot of this is going to be unscripted. When I go through these great books, as we've been going through the last couple of weeks, I have to really sit down with my notes. I annotate when I read, and I have to really think about how I'm going to present these ideas to you. And today I'm just going to go off the cuff and kind of talk about what I think is significant. So the first thing that we need to address address here is that the Mises Caucus took over the Libertarian Party. So on May 28th this year, the Mises Caucus officially took control of the Libertarian Party at the Libertarian National Convention, which was held this year in Reno, Nevada, and all of my friends that went there said it was extremely hot. Not only did they take control of the party, the chair is a Mises Caucus person, but they won every single seat at the Libertarian National Convention, and they garnered a majority of the support from the delegates that attended. And they were able to do this because for the last several years, they have been slowly making state libertarian parties more and more aligned with Mises Caucus priorities. And so this takeover of the Libertarian Party was years in the making. It wasn't a shot out of the dark. There were a lot of people that kind of knew going into the LNC that this was going to be the direction that the party was going to take. Now, I view this as a positive step forward for the Libertarian Party, and I want to say at the very beginning of this that just because I affiliate with the Mises Caucus and I think that they're doing great things, it doesn't mean that every single person that is in the Mises Caucus that makes statements, it doesn't mean I agree with everything that everyone in the Mises Caucus has said. So I just want to go ahead and put that out there right now. And I also don't think that libertarians that are not associated with Mises Caucus or that find the Mises Caucus to be a little too extreme, I also think they're libertarians too. Like I'm very ecumenical in my views on the liberty movement. And so when I say that I support the Mises Caucus, I'm not doing this to the detriment of other people that might be critical of it. I'm just saying this is kind of where I'm coming from. Now, there were a lot of people within the Libertarian Party, especially people that had been associated with the LP for a long time, that resigned in disgust over the Mises Caucus takeover. And I think there was a lot of information about the Mises Caucus that might not have been true that was released to the media by people that had been in the LP for a long time that didn't like the new direction that the Mises Caucus was taking. And there have also been several hit pieces about the Mises Caucus, as I said before, that have been published by mainstream media outlets in the wake of the Mises takeover. We're going to look at one example from a left-wing source that I think is indicative of the way that, unfortunately, the news media works in general today. And then I'm going to look at a really disappointing one that was published by Reason. Again, Dave Smith covers all of this in his episode, but I want to give my thoughts on this today. Again, I personally support the Mises Caucus. I want to address some of the criticism of it on the show. And again, there are a lot of people in the Mises Caucus that are not. I would say that their personality type and their style do not align with my own. There are a lot of people that do make very inflammatory statements within the Mises Caucus and within the LP in general. Obviously, politics does this to people, and one of the principles that I have on this show is that I try not to attack other people's personality. I try to stay focused on ideas, and I try to do all that kind of stuff. But for those of you guys that are like, man, I've heard a lot of bad things about this Mises Caucus stuff. How can you as a Protestant identify with it? Well, political parties are kind of like churches. They're always going, no matter what, you find a church you absolutely love, there are going to be people in that church that are crazy, because there are people that are crazy that exist in all areas of life. Like, there is no organization that is full of well-intentioned, good-hearted people that are always going to do and say the right thing. This is just called real life. Like, people are complicated. People make lots and lots of mistakes, and we have to just learn to deal with that. And so it's very easy to pick out, one or two of the bad apples within the Libertarian Party or within the Mises Caucus and say, the whole thing must look like these loudmouths that say awful things on social media. But you could easily do that with any political party or any organization. There will always be people within every organization that do not reflect the values of the organization, or that maybe offer a more extreme or incendiary presentation of that organization. And that is especially true in church. I love the church that I go to right now, but there are definitely people that do and say things there that I don't agree with, and that's okay. This is one of the things that I think adults need to understand, is that if any thinking and intelligent person will have disagreements with every single other human being on at least some issues. My worldview and my way of thinking about the world is constantly changing, and so there's no other person in this world that I agree with 100%, including myself. And I'm sure that if I recorded this podcast in 2023 instead of 2022, my views on some particular issues will either have been more nuanced or will have changed. That's just a part of life, and that's okay. For those of you that might not be familiar with the Libertarian Party, we are going to explain the history of the Mises Caucus. We're going to look at some of the criticisms, as I said before, that were leveled against it. And then, again, like I said, I want to explain why the Mises Caucus, despite the fact that there have been some remarks that have been made that are definitely inflammatory, I think it's positive development for the LP. And just to go ahead, just to frame this for you, if those of you guys are like, oh man, some of these Mises Caucus people have said some bad things, have we paid attention to anything that the Democrats or the Republicans have been saying for the last of forever? Like, there are always incendiary people in politics. It's always very, very toxic, and we'll address that later on in the show. Again, one more time, just to remind you, if you're not a Mises Caucus-oriented libertarian, or if you're a Protestant that's listening to this show that's unfamiliar with Libertarian Party politics, please remember, like I said before, that I'm ecumenical, and I believe that every philosophy needs some healthy disagreement in order to refine its principles. I'm recording this episode not to attack anyone, but just to say this is where I come from. And again, I'm not the right person really to be talking about this. I hope that in a future episode of this show, if this show continues to gain momentum like it has been, I would love to be able to interview some of the people on this show. I'd love to be able to interview some of the people on this show that I meet at my libertarian events, and so we'll see if we can make that happen. So let's get into it. Like with every episode, we're going to have a little bit of a historical overview of the LP and where the Mises Caucus fits in with that, and then we're just going to talk about some of the challenges to it. So the Libertarian Party was established, I think, in the 1970s. It's been around for 50 or 60 years, and the campaign of both Gary Johnson in 2016 and Joe Jorgensen in 2020, both of whom, as I've said on this show, I voted for, I supported them. I really like Joe Jorgensen a lot. I think she's very principled, and Gary Johnson, you know, he was really my political introduction to libertarianism, and I know he has a lot of flaws as a candidate, and a lot of Mises Caucus people make fun of Gary Johnson, but for somebody like me that was brand new to kind of politics and brand new to the Libertarian Party, I thought that Gary Johnson was much more principled than either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. And so these were, I think, the Libertarian Party's two best national showings. I think based on the polling data and the raw numbers, I think that the last three election cycles, Gary Johnson ran in 2012 for the LP as well. I think these were the Libertarian Party's three best showings there. Now, in the wake of the 2020 election, there were a lot of concerns about, in the wake of the 2016 election, there were a lot of concerns about Gary Johnson's campaign. He did make several mistakes, several very ugly mistakes on the campaign trail, and there were many times during his campaign that I felt like he compromised some of those libertarian principles. And there were several people within the Libertarian Party that believed that he did not do a good enough job of articulating those libertarian principles. They kind of felt like he was this middle ground between progressivism and conservatism, and they wanted a more explicitly libertarian, philosophically oriented party. And that's why I had the quote from Ron Swanson at the beginning of the episode: libertarianism is not progressivism or conservatism. It's not a combination of the two. Libertarianism is its own thing, and we always have to be mindful of that. And the Mises Caucus, which was named after the great Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, we compared his work with New Testament scholar Michael Gorman's work on Revelation in episode 3. So if you want a little bit of background on Mises, you can go and listen to that episode there. The Mises Caucus is named after Ludwig von Mises. Again, classic Austrian economist, very important, very influential within the libertarian movement. And it was established by a man named Michael Heiss in 2017. And the goal of this, despite what you might hear in the media, is the goal of the Mises Caucus was an attempt to challenge the party establishment to promote more explicitly libertarian principles. They felt like the Libertarian Party had maybe compromised on some of their principles, or they weren't emphasizing the right sort of libertarian principles, and they wanted to push the Libertarian Party to down a more principled road, to a more principled direction. So the Mises Caucus in 2019 formed a political action committee, and they wanted to support libertarian candidates. It was like a fundraising kind of thing. And at the local level, the Mises Caucus has won some elections around the country. That there have been several Mises Caucus victories at the local level in different cities around the country there. And it was during this time, 2018, 2019, that a lot of really prominent libertarian voices, such as Tom Woods. Tom Woods is, again, my favorite libertarian podcaster. I listen to his show almost every single episode that he releases. I love Tom Woods. He's a historian, a great intellectual, a great great economist, just fantastic. And I think that Tom Woods really does represent kind of the Murray Rothbard tradition of libertarianism. I would even say that Tom Woods has kind of taken the flame of Murray Rothbard and the Libertarian Party. But then other voices within the party, Dave Smith, Scott Horton, Maj Touré, all of these people that have been, associated with the libertarian movement for a long time, backed the Mises Caucus. They began to realize that the Mises Caucus was moving in a more libertarian direction. And again, I'm a huge fan of the work of all four of these guys. And again, it was Tom Woods' show in particular where I learned about what was happening in the party. Tom Woods was the introduction to me because I was trying to find a good interview with Scott Horton. I bought his book on a whim on Amazon, and I wound up accidentally coming in contact with Tom Woods' show, and I've been a great listener ever since, and Tom Woods has really been helpful in helping me move into more of kind of the radical libertarian way of looking at things. All of these guys are associated with the Mises Caucus. And again, I just want to say here, all of these guys were very critical of Johnson and Jorgensen. But if Johnson or Jorgensen got the LP nomination, I would still vote for them again. They are still better, and I think the Libertarian Party needs to remember this, and the Mises Caucus needs to remember this, is that Gary Johnson and Joe Jorgensen were still much, much better than the alternatives, like way better than the alternatives. And yes, they both made missteps on the campaign trail, but Joe Jorgensen is extremely principled, and in all of her interviews, she was very calm. She did a great job of just outlining libertarian principles without backing down. I thought Joe Jorgensen was a really good and really effective candidate. Her biggest mistake, and this is where the Mises Caucus really started to pick up, was after the 2020 election, the Mises Caucus believed that the Jorgensen campaign and the party in general should have been more vocal about the lockdowns. Like, they believed that the party blew a huge opportunity to combat the narrative about lockdowns and about mask mandates and about vaccine mandates and all of those things, and that the party was not aggressive enough on kind of woke political correctness. And in reality, we've talked a little bit about how wokeness, it is based on some sort of Marxist or critical theory ideas about social relationships, but all that woke culture is just the political correctness culture of the 1980s and the 1990s in modern guise. It's just political correctness. And so the Mises Caucus after 2020 really wanted to focus on being more vocal about the lockdown and combating political correctness. And I think that it's that drive to combat political correctness, that sickness with the fact that everyone in society is always really uptight about the words that they use all the time. I think that drives a lot of the more incendiary rhetoric in the Mises Caucus right now. People are being consciously anti-woke, and they're saying things that are deliberately offensive to try to counter the kind of uptight, politically correct woke culture that's taken over a lot of popular conversation in America. And that was the idea behind that. So the Mises Caucus after 2020 has been gaining momentum ever since, again, taking over state party after state party. And in May, Angela McArdle, who was, I think, the chair of the Los Angeles County Libertarian Party, she became the chair of the Libertarian National Convention, winning 69% of the vote. One of the things that we're going to see in the articles that we're going to read today is that they both, like all the articles that we're going to look at, not only do they screen out completely the Joe Jorgensen campaign, but they also fail to recognize that the chair of the LNC, which they're going to be criticized as being sexist and racist and all that stuff, is run by a woman. I just want to point that out there. And again, they won, Angela McArdle won 69% of the vote. The Mises Caucus just swept the boards. They're in control of every position of the Libertarian National Convention right now. And they're the ones that have the power and the movement in the party. And again, a lot of these people were very much influenced by the Ron Paul campaigns of 2008 and 2012. They support the Austrian School of Economics, which was developed by Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek and Murray Rothbard. The Mises Caucus they're based on radical free market ideas. The Mises Caucus is against central banking. It's against war. It's against identity politics, and it believes in decentralization and localism, that we need to take more and more power away from the federal government. Not everyone in the Mises Caucus, including myself, is an anarchist. I do believe that there is a role for local government. Government exists, as John Locke says, to protect our natural rights, but the only effective governments work at the smallest, most decentralized level. And this is kind of what, Montesquieu is getting at in his Spirit of the Laws, another great Enlightenment philosopher, that government needs to be divided. And I believe that we need to go even further than Montesquieu's prescription, and I think the government needs to not only be divided, but it needs to be devolved to the lowest form possible. And so all of these platforms are central to basic libertarian philosophy. And like if we step back and look at this, the Mises Caucus is very vocal and very radical about this, but these are not platform planks that are much different than the Libertarian Party has always espoused. I think the Mises Caucus just has a much more aggressive way of going about talking about these issues, which was the goal all along. Again, after 2016 and 2020, the Mises Caucus just believed that the Libertarian Party needed to be more aggressive in their libertarian principles instead of trying to find a middle ground between progressivism and conservatism. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Again, I'm going to go with what Ron Swanson says at the beginning of the episode. Libertarianism is not progressivism. It's not conservatism. And Gary Johnson's famous comment that it's, kind of socially liberal and fiscally conservative, I don't think that does it. I think libertarianism is something that is much different than that. So ever since this Mises Caucus takeover, and I'm sure by the time you guys will hear this episode, there will be even more articles that will be published about this. Several news outlets have published articles linking the Mises Caucus, of course, to the far right or the alt-right, because this is what the media always does. They have this category, the far right. They're painted as kind of these radical extremists that want to take over the country and destroy all of society. And so if you can attribute the values or the beliefs of a group to the alt-right, that in the minds of the progressive press allows you to delegitimize whatever person or whatever group of people you are criticizing. And again, they're going to associate nearly everyone with the far right. Interestingly, in the anti-Mises articles that were published by The Nation, which we're going to look at today in Salon, and the article in Salon uses, I think, The Nation as its primary source. The pictures used at the beginning of the article show Gary Johnson, which he's not a member of the Mises Caucus. And I also want to point out, because we're going to criticize this article that was written by The Nation, they omit a lot, and there are a lot of not just half truths in there, but outright lies or ways that there are definitely outright lies. I'm not going to go back on that statement. They do lie to you, and they deliberately misrepresent a lot of the things that are said by prominent leaders within the libertarian movement. And we just have to understand that. Like, the media is always going to lie to you, and we cannot trust any of these people to give us accurate information. But I also am interested in the fact, too, that Gary Johnson was the picture for these articles, when in reality, Jo Jorgensen was very successful in her 2020 run from the Libertarian Party. But I think that, like, both of these articles, and the one that was put out by the Southern Poverty Law Center, another one that we're going to briefly mention, they don't even mention Jo Jorgensen's run, and they certainly don't have any pictures of her on there. And again, I think this is, in my opinion, probably because the fact that Jo Jorgensen was the only woman that ran for president in 2020, or maybe the Green Party put up a Jill Stein again. I'm not really sure, but Jo Jorgensen was the most prominent woman running for president in 2020, and that would contradict this mainstream media narrative about the LP, that the LP is becoming more and more bigoted. How could a bigoted party possibly endorse a female who is running for president? So they just completely threw Jo Jorgensen's name down the memory hole there. I didn't want anyone to remember that the Libertarian Party only 2 years ago ran a woman for president. And I like to remind my progressive friends of that I actually voted for a woman in 2020. If you want to do the dumb identity politics, the reductionistic identity politics game, then I can at least claim the moral high ground, and that I have no problem voting for a woman for president at all. So the Southern Poverty Law Center article was written before the convention, and obviously it labels people within the Mises orbit as extremist, of course never defining what the term extremist means. And the article predictably concludes at the end, and this is the final paragraph of the article, that the Mises Caucus is racist. And again, the word racist in 2022 does not mean somebody who is prejudiced against somebody else based on the color of their skin. The word racist in 2022 means they have ideas that I don't like. And I know that there's this structural definition of racism, that racism isn't about individualism, it's about systems in society, and if you support those systems, then you're implicitly supporting racism, blah, blah, blah. But as an Austrian, as someone who, from my perspective, believes not only in the fact that the Bible tells us that we're all created in the image and likeness of God, and who believes in, kind of this methodological individualism, the idea that individuals make their own choice, I don't believe in that whole structural racist stuff anyways. It just doesn't make any sense. So you can definitely read it. I'm going to provide a link to the SPLC the article below, but it's just predictable kind of clickbait news trash, unfortunately, and it completely mischaracterizes everyone in the article there. So. Again, the Salon article uses the Nation article as its source, so I'm not going to really look at the Salon article, although I have the link to that down there. Again, Gary Johnson front and center at the top of this, and it just repeats a lot of the talking points that emerged out of the Nation article, where essentially the Mises Caucus is associated with the alt-right and with conservative political extremism, which doesn't make any sense. So we're going to take a look at the Nation article. I've read it, but I don't have any planned remarks on this. I just kind of want to scroll through it on the show, talk to you guys about some of the problems with this article here, and then just see if we can come to some conclusions about it. And then I'm going to look at the one that I think disturbed me and disappointed me the most, which was a hit piece, and we have to call it a hit piece that was ran by Reason Magazine. And I am a big fan, a subscriber of Reason Magazine, but I think that when it comes to the Mises Caucus takeover of the LP, and I also think that when it comes to maybe the efficacy of the vaccines, the people at Reason have made some big mistakes in the last year in the way that they've presented the news from a libertarian perspective. I still like Reason. I'm not going to cancel my subscription, but I do have to address the fact that they did publish an unfair hit piece on the Mises Caucus that just repeats kind of these mainstream or progressive talking points. I guarantee you, too, the article that I'm going to look at from The Nation here is a hit piece on the Mises Caucus, but I'm telling you right now, as the Mises Caucus continues to gain steam, there will be right-wing sources. There will be right-wing sources that will criticize the Mises Caucus as well. So when I say this today, I'm not calling out progressives in general here. The kind of trash news, the misrepresentation, all of that stuff is just as prominent on the right side of the aisle as it is on the left, and I'm not going to pretend that it is. So this article in The Nation was written by an author, a journalist named Jet Here, I think is how you pronounce his name. I hope I don't mischaracterize that. And it came out on June 6th of 2022. And the title of it is "The Libertarian Party Goes Alt-Right by Embracing Bigotry." This is the subtitle. Libertarians are poised to help re-elect Trump. So again, right there in the title, they're associating the Mises Caucus with the alt-right, which is this very nebulously defined term of people, I guess, supposedly that support Trump, and that by somehow, and also the implication in the subtitle is that the Mises Caucus is full of bigots, whatever that means. Again, they're not going to mention Joe Jorgensen in this article, and they're going to kind of gloss over the fact that Angela McArdle became the chair. I guess sexism is not the primary form of bigotry in the Mises Caucus, according to this article. I don't know. And then also they're making the claim that libertarians are poised to help re-elect Trump here. All right, so again, you got this big picture at the top of it of Gary Johnson. He's smiling and pointing at the camera. Very, very great there. So the article begins actually with a pretty good history of third parties in the United States and the impact that they've had on major presidential elections. So that's good stuff. The first couple of paragraphs are really helpful, and I think that that's great. But then I think the third paragraph down, this is when they start challenging the Mises Caucus takeover. It says, in defiance of this history of the Libertarian Party kind of being a spoiler and helping give policy ideas to the other parties, the LP now seems to have entered a topsy-turvy world where it has started mimicking the Republicans. Since Donald Trump launched his presidential campaign, the dominant political story on the right has been the GOP's becoming steadily Trumpized, a trend visible in both policy, more protectionist, anti-immigrant, and more unilateralist in foreign policy, and also cultural style, with Trump's insult comedian routine now de rigueur among Republican candidates. They talk about that. Then they're going to, and this is where things really go off the rail. A couple paragraphs down, they talk about, they read this. In July 28, 2017, Jeff Deist, the president of the Mises Institute, and the Mises Institute is based out of Auburn, Alabama. I have a ton of their books. They release a lot of works from Rothbard and Hayek and Mises. A lot of great stuff there. They give a lot of speech, and they're focused almost exclusively on Austrian economics. But Jeff Deist published a blog post and gave a speech arguing that blood and soil and God and nation still matter to people. Libertarians ignore this at the risk of irrelevance. The phrase blood and soil already had an unmistakably fascist overtone, but it took on an even more gruesome connotation 2 weeks after the post during the infamous Charlottesville Unite the Right rally. They talked about the white supremacist who chanted blood and soil there. In the wake of the event, Nicholas Sarwark, then chair of the Libertarian Party, signed an open letter warning of the dangers of fascism. And the vice chair of the Libertarian Party, Arvin Vohra, argued that the Mises Institute had been turned into a sales funnel for the white nationalist branch of the alt-right. Here's the problem with all of this, though, is that Jeff Deist was saying in his blog post and in his speech, which you can go to the Mises Caucus, or you can go to the Mises Institute website. They have a ton of great resources there. I posted links to them, I think, in episodes before. You can go to their website and actually look at what Jeff Deist wrote and what Jeff Deist said, and all he was saying is that libertarians should not ignore the fact that there are a lot of people in America who believe in blood and soil and God and nation. That's all he's saying. He's not saying that libertarians should embrace that at all. That wasn't at all where Jeff Deist was going to go for that. And Jeff Deist has been on the Tom Woods Show. He has his own podcast called the Human Action Podcast. Jeff Deist is a typical intellectual, very cool, very rational, has a lot of great ideas. In no way is Jeff Deist an incendiary or an inflammatory person, and in no way does the Mises Institute at all support any of the alt-right policies that this article is claiming to push. Again, all he was saying is that we as libertarians need to be aware that blood and soil matter for people, and that should change the approach that we take when talking to other people about politics. It's so easy to understand, but this article deliberately misrepresents what Jeff Deist, who is a very calm, very collected academic, said but you can go and read the blog post for yourself. Like, they're deliberately taking Deist out of context here. Now, we shouldn't be surprised because the media, and again, both the conservative media and the progressive media, they love to take people out of context. They love half-truths. For someone that's not familiar with Deist or the Mises Institute, if you're reading this, you're thinking, oh my God, these people, they really do support racism. I can't believe that the libertarians supported blood and soil. But he was not supporting that at all. He was just saying that we need to take into account that there are plenty of people that believe in this idea. And the fact that the Libertarian Party chair, now Sarwark and Vohra, they have their own kind of complicated history. I'm not going to go into the personal stuff on that right now, but the fact that they were saying the Mises Institute had been turned into a sales funnel for white nationalists and all of that kind of stuff, I just think that that's completely disingenuous of them to do that. And then the article goes on to say the ensuing arguments over blood and soil led to the creation of a Mises Caucus, which aimed to overthrow the pragmatic Gary Johnson wing of the party and adopt the incendiary culture war politics of the hard right. That's not true either. The Mises Caucus was not formed to try to be a blood and soil version of the Libertarian Party. That's just a flat out lie. The Mises Caucus was formed because the people of the Mises Caucus believed, like Michael Heiss, they believed that Gary Johnson's campaign was a failure to adequately address libertarian principles, and they saw the Libertarian Party moving in a less and less principled direction. And again, when the vice chair of the Libertarian Party is arguing that the Mises Institute, which is an institute that promotes Austrian economics, has somehow been turned into a sales funnel for the white nationalist branch of the alt-right, yeah, the party was definitely going off course and needed to be changed. So not only does this argument misrepresent the reason why the Mises Caucus, or this article misrepresent the reason why the Mises Caucus was formed in the first place, they can't even understand the fundamental issues that are associated with that. And again, I've looked at Trump's economic policies. I'm sorry, but an Austrian-oriented president would not have signed the CARES Act into law. An Austrian-oriented president would not have pushed to have higher tariffs and quotas on countries that they don't like, and an Austrian oriented president would not have pushed America first economic production. Like, none of those things are in any way commensurate with the ideas of Austrian economics. It's just totally ignorant and totally wrong. They then go on to talk about how the hit piece that Reason wrote on the Mises Caucus, which we'll talk about here in just a second, and then they talk about how the Mises Caucus in California invited someone they're calling anti-Semitic provocateur named Brian Sharp, who is black, to speak at the state convention, and then just talked about how Angela McArdle, again, some of the only, they don't give her a lot of space in this episode, but they just talked about how Angela McArdle defended that, and essentially, I don't really know a lot about the background of that incident, but I guess this guy, Brian Sharp, just has asked questions before about whether or not Jews run Hollywood, and I don't know about that there, but again, that's one guy, and if you are in a political party, you're allowed to have people that have alternate perspectives come in and talk. Again, this is the idea that Tom Woods talks about on his show all the time, that we have kind of created in this society a 3x5 index card of ideas that we're allowed to talk about in public, and there are ideas that are just not socially acceptable for the mainstream media to cover, and I think that's wrong. Like, again, I'm a free speech absolutist. As a Christian, I think we need to have as many conversations in society about as many ideas as possible, because that always helps us get to a greater and greater degree of truth. That's why I'm very happy as a Protestant having conversations with people that don't believe in God or with Catholics, because not only does that give me an opportunity to present my ideas, it helps me learn why other people think the way that we do. We should not be afraid of talking to people that have a different perspective than us. So again, they're going to go on to talk about the Reason article, which I'm gonna express here in a minute, and then they talk a little bit more about that. And then the final article here, again, it says taking the Libertarian Party out as a competitive force will help consolidate the right-wing vote around the Republican Party. Once the Libertarian Party becomes a husk of its former self, the alt-right faction will continue to assist a Trumpized GOP in ways that parallel groups like the Proud Boys. MAGA libertarians, that's funny, will be a potent vector for spreading bigotry on social media. The Mises Caucus are the nominal winners in the internecine libertarian wars, but the ultimate beneficiary could, this is very, very scary, be Donald Trump. There's nothing that makes sense about the conclusion of this article. Anyone that's ever met a Mises Caucus libertarian knows that there's nothing MAGA about the libertarian movement at all. Yes, there are people that are going to be really aggressive in the language that they're going to use online and things like that, but there is absolutely no overlap between the Libertarian Party and kind of the MAGA hard right. It's just we're just operating in completely different spheres of reality. I also think that it's interesting in this article that they don't mention any of kind of the intellectual bearers of the Mises Caucus ideology. They don't talk about Tom Woods. They don't talk about Dave Smith. They don't talk about Maj Touré. They don't talk about Scott Horton. All of these people have had a very big impact philosophically on the direction of the Mises Caucus, and this Nation article completely ignores those important figures. And I think that a lot of mainstream sources do this. And this is the problem, is like a lot of the mainstream media, they don't want to actually engage with the big ideas. It's so much easier to attack somebody's personality than it is to engage with them on an ideological level. And so this Nation article is just going to revert to calling everyone in the Mises Caucus Trumpist without actually having to engage with any of the ideas, the real ideas that are being promoted by the Mises Caucus Party. And again, this is my criticism of the way that news and the way that commentary and the way that conversations are had in our society today. It's all style and absolutely no substance. People are only concerned about destroying the personality of other people. They do not care about having actual substantive arguments about real ideas. And this Nation article is a textbook example of that. And I think it's only going to get worse. Again, the Mises Caucus, obviously, if the Nation's going to come out and kind of have a preemptive strike on the Mises Caucus, there will be more and more defamatory articles that will come from NPR and CNN. The Mises Caucus is gaining real steam right now, and we have to be aware that there are going to be many, many more hit pieces on the Mises Caucus, but we also have to understand why the Mises Caucus will be constantly misrepresented in the media. And I guarantee you that there will be misrepresentations of this coming from the right as well. This isn't just going to be a progressive phenomenon. Once conservatives realize that the Libertarian Party is a threat to gaining votes for the Republicans, they're going to attack the Mises Caucus too. And this is another irony in the article that was published in The Nation, is that they somehow, they obviously don't want Trump to get reelected. So if the Libertarian Party is pulling votes away from the Republican Party, then doesn't that actually suit the Nation's intent of not having Trump elected to a second term? I just don't understand where they're going with that. But again, the Mises Caucus and the MAGA movement are two completely different groups. There might be some rhetorical overlap or some style overlap, but that's about it. And again, this article also assumes that there are only two sides of the political debate, but the establishment loves this. And this is just almost every American thinks that you either have to choose between the progressive Democrats and the conservative Republicans, and you don't. There are other ways of looking at all of these issues, and articles like this, they only reinforce the idea that there are two sides. And so the libertarians are really these MAGA conservatives in disguise. And that's just completely completely wrong. And also, what would they rather see? What would they rather be? Would they rather the Libertarian Party be kind of like a quasi free market progressive movement? I don't know what they're looking for with that. I do want to briefly talk before we wrap up today, because I'm going on for quite a long time. This is looking like just based on the time, it might be my longest episode. But I want to take a look at the Reason article. This one really disappoints me. As I said before, I'm a supporter of Reason. I actually submitted a question to the Reason Roundtable podcast. I listen to the Reason Roundtable every Wednesday morning on my Wednesday morning run. I've been doing that for years right now. But I submitted a question on vaccine mandates earlier in the year, and I was kind of disappointed. It was the first time I was ever really disappointed in Reason. They did, in all fairness, read my question on the podcast, and they answered it. But everyone on the show except for Nick Gillespie basically said that they thought that vaccine mandates were okay, or that there were places where vaccine mandates could be justified. I thought that was disappointing, but I understood the arguments that they were making. I don't think they were being disrespectful or anything like that. And then I've just realized over the last year that I feel like Reason should have been more aggressive with the vaccine mandates, and they should have been more open about the fact that the vaccines were not the panacea that they were promised. Now, the vaccines, we haven't talked about them on the show. There may be some benefits to some people, but like every medicine or every substance you put in your body, some people are going to have an adverse reaction to it, and people should be able to make that decision on their own in conversation with their doctor, and that wasn't even an option for a lot of people, unfortunately. So they right after the Libertarian National Convention, Reason ran this piece, and the title, it's written by Brian Doherty, and he's written some really good pieces for Reason before that I've enjoyed. The headline is Mises Caucus takes control of the Libertarian Party, and then the subtitle is where things already start to go downhill. It says, dominating the convention body by more than 2/3, the Mises Caucus claims to offer an edgier, more libertarian organization. That's positive, but then foes accuse it of right-wing deviationism and racism. And I'm not sure why. One of the really great things about Reason magazine is that they have been, over the last several years, very critical of kind of the culture war reflex of calling every idea that somebody doesn't like racist. Like, Reason has been very, very good on free speech issues for a long time. I'm not sure why, when the Mises Caucus takes control of the Libertarian Party, they have to put in the subtitle for the headline that it might be associated by its enemies with racism. And so this article, I'm putting a link to it. I hope that you go on and read it. It talks about how the style of the LP has become a lot more aggressive, and I think I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. It gives a much more nuanced history of the development of the Mises Caucus. He says this, while McCardle was the Mises Caucus candidate, behind-the-scenes mastermind of its victory was caucus founder and leader Michael Heiss. His disapproval of Bill Weld, Gary Johnson's running mate in 2016, was an initial inspiration for the caucus's launch. He found Weld painfully lacking in libertarian orthodoxy, especially when it came to issues such as war and gun regulations. And I appreciate that that Doherty is not trying to associate the Mises Caucus with the whole blood and soil movement. He doesn't take that step. He actually acknowledges that the Mises Caucus was designed to be more of an official platform for LP or for libertarian sort of philosophical issues there, and I really do appreciate that. But then he says here, the caucus's official platform is plumb-line libertarian, but its foes say that too many Mises Caucus members and fans downplay libertarian positions that might offend the right, are intentionally obnoxious and bullying, and are often racist. For example, the New Hampshire LP, a powerful vector of Mises Caucus messaging, tweeted on Martin Luther King Day that America isn't in debt to black people. If anything, it's the other way around. The tweet was later deleted. Now, I am going to agree with Doherty there. That's a very, very insensitive and uncritical tweet. And I'm glad that they deleted it. And that's a good example of how I think online rhetoric can be harmful to really, really good ideas. The sense that the caucus is soft on or actively encourages racism attracted the attention of the Southern Poverty Law Center just before the convention began, which aired the concerns in the story reported with cooperation from many Libertarian Party members upset with the Mises Caucus. And so, again, it just talks about how, and again, I just don't understand how Reason could quote the SPLC's article and think that the SPLC, who is completely against the values of Reason Magazine could have any sort of objective stake in this conversation. They just don't. It's an obvious hit piece, and the good people at Reason should have known that it was. Now, they're going to go on to talk in this article about they'll mention Dave Smith, they'll mention Scott Horton, they'll mention Angela McArdle and other people in that movement there, but they're going to talk a lot about kind of the tension between the Mises Caucus and the kind of the old guard of the Libertarian Party in this article, and the entire tone of this article is critical. I think that's what I'm getting at here. Is I just don't like the direction that Brian Doherty takes this article, and it just kind of makes it appear as if these criticisms from the progressive left are legitimate, and that's just not true. And so you should go and read the argument for yourself. I'm going to try to wrap up here in a minute because we're getting close to the end of time. You should definitely go and read the argument for yourself, but it does feel like it is a hit piece that was put out against the Mises Caucus by Reason Magazine. And I hope that Reason Magazine can take a more nuanced and more appreciative approach to that in the future. Now, yesterday on June 15th, they did release a documentary. Nick Gillespie was the one who interviewed, and I think Nick Gillespie is my favorite person over at Reason. I feel like he's a really balanced guy. You should definitely watch it. I'm going to put a link to that video there in the show notes. It's about a 30-minute long video, and I would highly encourage, like I said, everyone just to go and watch it and kind of see the other side. But even the tone of that video is pretty negative too. But I'm going to post a link there. There's some interesting stuff in that video. I just hope in the future that the Mises Caucus can get a more fair hearing from the Libertarian side of the aisle, and hopefully once the dust clears from all of the stuff that happened, the shakeup that happened at the LNC, we'll be able to move forward in a more analytical sort of way. There are a couple things I want to address real quick as we wrap up the show here. I do support the Mises Caucus, but how do I think that the Mises Caucus needs to proceed? One of the big criticisms leveled against the Mises Caucus is that they took a plank from the LNC on bigotry out. They completely removed the party plank on abortion, and they also changed some of the language regarding open borders. The thing that I want to say about this is that there are and have always been differences on emphasis within the libertarian movement. When you have a big tent philosophy like libertarianism, there are going to be people that have disagreements. Abortion is one of those extremely volatile issues within the Libertarian Party. There are a lot of people that believe, again, if you're like me and you believe that life begins at conception, you have a hard time seeing how abortion is not a violation of the right of the unborn child. But if you don't believe that life begins at conception, then you don't think that the state should regulate the right for a woman to have an abortion. And so libertarians can go either way, and in fact, they do. On open borders, it's the same kind of thing. There are a lot of libertarians, and Reason represents kind of the open borders aspect of this, where they think immigration is good. And I kind of tend to be. I'm not a completely open borders guy, but I definitely pro immigration as long as it's done in a responsible manner. But there are a lot of conflicts within the Libertarian Party over open borders, and so I think the change in the platform addresses that. Taking out a clause on bigotry in the LP platform was helpful because I don't think that as free speech advocates we need to say that we're not bigots. We're just not bigots. We shouldn't have to play the game where we bow down before all of the progressives that want us to do and say everything that they want to hear all the time. We know that we're not bigoted, or at least the majority of us are not bigoted, and so we don't need to have a platform in the party that says that we're not bigoted. You don't have to apologize for something that you didn't do. This show is also all about defending Protestant and libertarian principles. This is a big idea show, and so I love that the Mises Caucus is very aggressive in promoting libertarian principles. That's a step in the right direction. We need more political movements, and I wish the progressives and I wish the conservatives wouldn't be so wishy-washy when it comes to the public presentation of their ideas. Just tell people what you want to do and make intellectual arguments for it, and I think the Mises Caucus does a great job of doing that with the libertarian philosophical positions that the Mises Caucus has embraced. But we can be aggressive without being offensive, and there's no way in 2022 that you can argue for literally anything. I mean, the title of this show, The Protestant Libertarian, is automatically going to trigger and offend some people. But we can be aggressive and open about our principles without trying to be offensive, without going out of our way to saying deliberately offensive and socially shocking things. Again, I think that ideas are best presented in an intellectual manner and that we should focus more on ideas instead of just being kind of outrageous and inflammatory. Now, I will say that I've joined Twitter in order to promote my podcast. Twitter is a garbage hole, and like literally everyone on Twitter does and says horrible things all the time, including a lot of Christians that I follow on Twitter. I mean, people are just awful on the internet, and I think that if the Mises Caucus really wants to promote the ideas of liberty, if we really want to stick to Austrian economics and anti-war and ending the Fed and not being politically correct, then we need to stay on message. We should focus not on trying to be like this completely crazy offensive group, but just say, here are the ideas, here's how we're going to argue for them, because presenting those ideas is always going to help us win the day. The last thing that I want to say here is that I do believe, and this is a deeply biblical principle that I hold, that power is always a dangerous thing. This is why I'm a postmodernist. This is why I talk often on this show about the dangers of political power. Power corrupts people, and this is exactly the point of Genesis chapter 3. It's that when human beings are given the opportunity to grasp for power, they almost always use it to serve their own ends. Power is extremely dangerous, and libertarianism at its heart is a critique of power. It acknowledges that power is very corrupting and that power is often used for those that are in power to exploit those that are not in power. And I worry that as the Libertarian Party gains momentum with the Mises Caucus, that there will be people within the Mises Caucus that are tempted to use that power for their own ends. And again, this is one of the reasons why politics is so divisive and why it makes people so angry, and also a great argument for why we need power to be decentralized as much as possible, why we need to take power away from all groups of people and devolve it as much as possible to the local level. Power corrupts people. There's just no way around that. That is deeply, deeply fundamental to the biblical narrative about human nature. Yes, we are created in the image and likeness of God and are a very good part of God's creation, but we are also always tempted by the sin of trying to grasp for power. And I just want to throw that out there on record. I believe that the best way forward for the Libertarian Party in general and for libertarians in general is, as the Libertarian Party picks up steam, as we get power, don't use that for our own ends. We have to stay focused on principle, and we have to realize that power will always corrupt people. Well, that's going to be a wrap on the final. That's going to be a wrap on this episode here. This is the longest episode that I've ever recorded, clocking in at 51 minutes. Next week, we are going to look at the use and abuse of the word love in contemporary political and theological discourse. Love, like a lot of terms we've talked about on this show, is almost never defined, but often used. And so we are going to define the rules of the language game of love, and we are going to look at the biblical definition of love and how we should apply this to our thinking, not at all separate from what we discussed on this show today. One more note that I want to make before I leave, just kind of a housekeeping note. In the future, I have been reaching out to some authors about doing some interviews on this show. I want to get more people on. I want to be able to have interviews or conversations with other people. And while this isn't going to become another interview show, I do want to do that from time to time. Sometimes it's better than me giving you a review of a book or an article. It would be better to have the author on so that they can explain their ideas on their own. So in the future, we're going to be looking for that more. In particular, if you have any authors or any thinkers that you would like me to try to get on the show, again, email me or hit me up on Twitter, and I'll be happy to explore that idea. Thank you so much for listening to this super long episode. And thank you for listening to me repeat literally everything Dave Smith said over a month ago. I hope this was helpful for you guys, and we will see you guys back for episode 13 next week. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts about the show, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at ProLibertyPod. Again, you can follow me on Twitter at ProLibertyPod. You can also support the show by leaving a rating or a review on your favorite podcast app. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.